So glad you're here this morning. That wasn't a joke. Glad you're here this morning. Hope your 2020 is off to a great start. Are any of you like resolutioners? Like you've made resolutions? It's okay if you are. Anybody like the resolutions? Yeah, okay. For me, I do resolutions. Mine this year is the same as mine was last year. And last year it was to not go camping. And I did great. Knocked it out of the park. Thank you very much. Thank you. I did all 12 months, did not camp once. I intend to keep that going into 2020. So for those of you that love camping, that's great. I did go out to, I went near it. Yep. Yeah, I don't understand why people love camping. I haven't figured that out yet. If I'm going to spend vacation time and things, like I want to live better than my normal life, not worse than my normal life. Like haven't figured that out yet, but hopefully your year is off to a great start. If you're a person who loves the changes, like oh man, like I don't know if changes rattle you. I don't know if changes like that, like if you don't like to change, if you're like, no, I'm good, I don't need to mess with things that are going on in my life. Maybe you're one of those kind of people. My son, he's a creature of habit. He likes to do things the same way. We were gone for a few days. We were in Texas visiting family because who doesn't want to go to Texas? I don't want to go to Texas, in case you're wondering. Did not want to go. We went to Texas. I have family there. They make bad life choices. They live in Texas, and so we had to go visit. I know, we live in Florida. Like, use your vacation time. Come here where people actually want to vacation. Nobody says, you know where I want to vacation is a place called Kilgore, Texas. Nobody's ever like, I hope I go there for Christmas. But we did. And so we drove over to Texas. We were there for a few days. And before we left, I don't know if you do this in your house, we unplugged a lot of things. And my son, he'd gotten this Echo Dot, this little Amazon Echo Dot for kids in his room so that the CIA could hear what he talks about all day. Which, you know what, honestly, it's on them. Like if they want to hear his life, have fun with that. I mean, really, enjoy. I'd like to hear the recordings myself. And so he put this little Echo Dot in his room. Before we left, we unplugged it because we were afraid it might have alarms on it or different things, just because he loves to talk to this thing. Maybe he set an alarm or something. So we had people stay in our house because we have a dog that lives in our house. And we were like, maybe we should, we own the dog, but it lives in our house. And so we were like, maybe we should turn this off. And so we unplugged the Echo and we came back from vacation. And the first thing that Oliver did, he ran straight to his room to get to Alexa, his best friend. Her name's Alexa. And he ran to Alexa and he was like, Alexa! And Alexa didn't respond because she was unplugged. This is the downside of having a digital best friend is you can unplug them. I mean, it's the upside too, but it's the downside. And he's like, Alexa, and nothing. And he was like, oh no. And you could see in his face like he was very worried. He was like, Alexa! And she wasn't responding. And you could see like grief coming over his face like, I lost my best friend. She's died while we were gone. And finally we were like, Oliver, you just have to plug it in. He was like, oh, good. Oh, man, that's good. And he goes, it's just so many things have changed since we've been gone. Have they? This one thing has really changed. I mean, really changed your life. So many things have changed. Maybe you're a person who doesn't love change. Maybe those changes are happening around you. If we're being honest, this world that we're in is built to change. It's going to change. It's going to shift. It's going to sway. It's going to switch. I mean, there's things in this world that are constantly going to change. Right now, we're at the beginning of a new decade. We just left an old decade. We left one behind. There's going to be things like that are changing, right? There's constantly things there's technology that's coming, there's technology that's going, there are world leaders that are coming and rising up, there are world leaders that are failing, there are some that are fighting now. I mean, there's changes constantly happening all around us. This last year, you probably saw either a birth of a child, you saw the death of a loved one, you saw maybe it was a marriage, maybe it was a divorce, maybe it was starting school, maybe it was graduating from school. There's constantly changes happening. This world is just built to change. While we were in Texas, we went shopping with my nieces. We took them to an outlet mall because that's, again, the only, like, what else do you do in Texas? So literally the other option that day was to go to a dissection place for our kids to dissect worms. That's when I chose an outlet mall. That's the lowest. There's only two options, and the lowest one turned out to be dissection of worms. That tells you how low outlet malls are on my scale, but it was just above dissection of worms. So we went to the outlet mall. Guys, I wish I was making this up. We went to the outlet mall and we're with my nieces and they're shopping for things. And we show up to shop with them. And one of my nieces, she is wearing overalls, like overalls. She lives in Texas, but not that part of Texas, not like on a farm. And she has overalls and she has one of the straps like unbuttoned. You know what I'm talking about? Like she's Blossom. And I was like, are we doing this again? This is happening? And she, like, this was very fashionable apparently. And I was like, oh no, like we're back in this again. Like she's Melissa Joan Hart, MJH. I'm the only one who calls her that, but the MJH, she's Melissa Joan Hart. She's shown up with her overalls and I was like, we're back in this. Things are changing all the time. They even change so much that they come back around sometimes. Things are shifting and maybe you're feeling that. Maybe if you're like me, there's things where you start to feel kind of the world changing. There's just things under your feet that sometimes it feels like the world right under your feet has changed from what you thought it was to what it is now. Maybe there was something that's happened in your life. Maybe there was a death or a divorce or a disease, a disappointment, something like that that came along and you thought you had this world figured out and suddenly it's all shifted, it's all changed, it's all different. There's constantly going to be change. And that's just the way this world is built. And what I want to talk about over the next few weeks, and I think this is important for us to understand, is that we have to find a foundation within that shifting. We have to find something that we can stand on that's solid, something we can stay firmly planted in while everything else moves. Because things are constantly going to move. Things are constantly going to change. We have to find something that we're going to stay put on. Now, here's the thing, is a lot of times what we find is we find a few things that maybe we think are the things that are the foundation. Sometimes we think that wealth or money is the foundation. That's the one thing we can count on. If we have nothing else, but we have that, we're going to be okay, right? Or maybe it's people, maybe it's certain relationships. If I have that relationship, everything's going to be fine, no matter what happens around me. Maybe if it's people or it's politics, maybe it's if this government or this world leader is in place, then everything's going to be fine, no matter what shifts around me. Maybe it's your own religion. Maybe religion is the thing that you think if I hold on to that, then everything's going to be fine as things shift around me. Maybe there's just these things that you think if I just hold on to that, maybe it's power, maybe it's the position you're in or the job or the authority you've been given that you think if everything else falls apart, but I have this job or I have this position of authority, everything's going to be fine. And what we find is that if we look at what Jesus says, if we look at this foundation that he would tell us to lay, I would say that all of those, religion included, are not the places we're supposed to put our trust. They're not the places we're supposed to put our hope. They're not the place we're supposed to put our anchors down. Those are not the things that are supposed to hold us firm when everything else is shifting. We have to figure out what that is. And over the next few weeks, I want to look at those different areas. Today, we're just going to kind of broadly look and just begin this conversation about finding a firm foundation while everything else is shifting. And I want to look at those different areas over the next few weeks. But today, we're just going to kind of have like a little bit of an intro to this. You might be like, this isn't much of a sermon, and you probably are right. You might walk out of here and be like, this wasn't much of anything to it. Well, that's probably true. But it's just an intro to what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. Because Jesus talks about this firm foundation. He talks about a foundation that we're supposed to build things on. And I want to look at just the teaching that he gives us when he talks about this. If you have a Bible or a phone or a tablet, whatever you use, we're going to be in Luke chapter 6, in Luke chapter 6 today, looking at just a few verses where Jesus talks about this as we set up, as we kind of begin this series together of where we find our foundation. And Jesus in chapter 6 of Luke, it's the parallel to chapter 7 of Matthew. So if you want to go back sometime and read this in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus is in the middle of what's happening here is he's just finishing his biggest teaching. He's doing a sermon that might have been a very long sermon. It might have been a day-long sermon or a few days-long sermon. And so today I'm just going to do like a 2-day sermon. And then, yeah, you're welcome. And then you'll be out here 48 hours. But he did a multiple day long sermon that was probably condensed, put down into the Bible as the Sermon on the Mount, if you've ever heard of that. And it's where Jesus teaches on all these different topics. And Jesus has just finished teaching all of these different topics. It's his biggest sermon. And he talks about everything in this. He talks about grace. He talks about truth. He talks about wealth. He talks about what to do with money. He talks about sexuality. He talks about love. He talks about relationships. These are all the things Jesus is talking about. He's telling us like how all these things should work. All this teaching is happening. And when he gets to the end of that teaching, in Luke, you can find it in Matthew chapter 7, but in Luke chapter 6, there's another moment where Jesus he says the same thing kind of in parallel verses. The reason I want to use Luke today is because of this first line. I love that Luke records this. In Matthew, he does not record this first line. But the first line, this is in Luke chapter 6, verse 46. And the very first line, Jesus says, after he's finished all this teaching about all these different topics, he stops and he says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" Now, this is, if you're like me, I grew up in church. I don't say that like things were right in my life. I was the son of a pastor. My dad was a pastor, my mom was a pastor, my brother's a pastor. It's a family business. And I only say that because I've been in more therapy than you have. And so, like, things are perfect just means that's the reality. I grew up in this, and I remember, like, at a young age saying that I was following Jesus, that I started to follow Jesus, that I was giving my life to Jesus. Maybe you've had those moments, and maybe you've had this thing where you say, like, I gave my heart to Jesus, or I accepted Jesus, or I asked Jesus into my life, or I asked Jesus into my heart, which is physically very difficult to understand. And there's all these things that you might have used these phrases. For me, honestly, if I was to take one verse that Jesus says and really, like, say, yikes, this would be the verse for me. Why do you call me Lord? I don't know how you pray. I don't know the words you call Jesus, but maybe when you pray, you say things like Lord. Maybe you call him Lord. Maybe you've thought of Jesus as your Lord and Savior. If you're like me, maybe you have. Yet, if we're being honest with ourselves, we're calling him Lord, but we're not doing what he says. Ooh. He's saying, you're calling me one thing, and you can't, this is an oxymoron. You can't call someone Lord and not do what they say. You can't do both. They're either Lord or they're not. He's saying, why do you say this over and over again? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but you don't do what I say? And then he goes into this little parable. He says, I will show you, in verse 47, I will show you what he is like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. I will show you what they're like. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you a little parable about what this is like. Now notice he connects two things. He says, those people who hear my words, step one, and secondly, those who put them into practice, step two. Most of us have probably heard the words. Most of us probably have not done the second part of putting it into practice. This, which I think is fascinating. Like, I mean, we all know this, right? Like, if we were to, if I was to say, like, all of us have the information, like, all of us should have six-pack abs and be millionaires. We have the information, right? The problem is we don't do what we know, right? If you've ever been around a child, like any child, you just name the child. You know how this goes, right? Again, in my family, in my house, we have a dog. Let me say it that way. There's a dog that lives in my house, and it hasn't gone away yet. We have tried. I've left the gate open many times, and it just keeps coming back, and it's still there. And Hazel's still with us. It's been a year, guys. It's been a year. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. And she's still alive. Somehow. And we haven't tried to not make her alive. We just haven't done a great job of probably parenting her. So she still lives in our house. And she's become the thing in our house that my kids use as a distraction now for anything. I don't know if you've ever been around this, but my kids, if they're doing something, if they go play with Hazel, it's like an out. So if you're like, hey guys, get ready for bed, they're like, but I'm playing with Hazel. And how do you take away the joy of a child playing with their dog? Like they know they've got us cornered on this. And they're like, I'm just playing with Hazel. She just loves me so much. I'm having such a good time. How could you possibly make me go to bed? And so like, or put on your shoes. And they're like, but I'm playing with Hazel. And so I asked Marie last night, I said, can you think of an example where our kids have heard something, but not actually done it? Like they've heard us say it, but they don't actually listen and then do the thing we said. And she was like, yeah, just watch bedtime tonight. And so I did. And last night, sure enough, It was time to brush teeth. Everybody's supposed to brush teeth. You know who doesn't brush their teeth at bedtime? The dog. But you know who gets the most attention? The dog. And so we're like, you guys need to brush your teeth. And they're both like, no, but we're having so much fun with the dog. We love this dog so much. It loves us. How could you take away this dog from us right now? Because we're having such a good time. And so every time we said it, we were like, hey, you need to brush your teeth. You need to brush your teeth. You need to brush your teeth. And like we start getting louder. You know what I'm talking about, parents? And it's like start just this ramping up of volume. And finally, like you're like, you need to brush your teeth. And the kids look at us and they're like, why are you yelling at us? Like we're so abusive. They'll go to therapy for this someday. And we're like, you haven't heard anything we said? And they were like, no, we heard you the whole time. Well, then why didn't you do what we said? Why are you still playing with the dog? Why are you not brushing your teeth? Right? Like, it's amazing because they did. They heard every time. They did not listen every time, but they heard every time we said it. I think there are some of us in this room, and myself included, that I feel like there are times that God is yelling now, here's what I want you to do, and we're still like, but I'm playing with the dog. I mean, I hear it. I get it. But I'm not going to do it because I'm doing this other thing. I'm not going to go do it right now. I hear it. I've heard the words. I've heard the things many times. I cannot tell you guys how many times I sit with people, and I get, this is one of the hardest parts of being a pastor, is a lot of times I'm brought in at the end of a scenario. Okay, so like I'm brought in when the marriage has fallen apart. I'm brought in when people are at their financial lowest point. I'm brought in like at that time. That's when you call a pastor, right? When somebody is on their deathbed, when somebody is at their lowest point in their life. That's when you bring in the pastor. You don't bring them in when things are good. You bring them in when things are bad. It's a lot of fun. I'm not saying that it's not a bad thing. I don't mind doing it. But the problem is the foundation has already been laid. The foundation of that life, the foundation of that relationship, the foundation of that business has already been laid. It's too late for me to do anything. And I feel like there are so many times, there are so many marriages I know that would be saved if we would have had Jesus as the foundation. There are so many relationships that would be repaired if Jesus was the foundation. There are so many lives that have been ruined that would have been restored. Why? If Jesus was the foundation. If he would have been there at the beginning. If when we heard God yelling, we would have just stopped and done it that way the first time. But we wait until there's cracks in the foundation. We wait until the whole thing is starting to fall apart. We wait until everything is blowing up in our faces, and that's when we're like, we should probably fix it. If we would have started there instead of ended there, it probably would have been totally different. And what Jesus is saying, he's saying you need to hear the words and not just hear them, but do them. Put them into practice. Now, this would have been one of the hardest things for Jesus to comprehend and for him to be able to get people to understand. Jesus was a rabbi. So as a rabbi, his job, his actual job, like what he got paid money for, was to read the Torah, read the first 5 books of the Bible. And then what he would do is he would do this thing called a yoke. And his yoke was how he would act. So what he would do, his job as a rabbi was to read the first 5 books of the Bible. He would have memorized them, which is just mind-blowing. Like, can you imagine memorizing Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers? Memorizing them word for word. Like, the only thing I've got up here is like a Princess Bride, basically. Like, that's all I've got memorized start to finish. That's all I can handle in my brain. And he had 5 books of the Bible. What he would have done is memorize them, and then he would have acted them out, and that was called his yoke. How he acted based on what he read was his yoke. That's how he acted. And so his whole job was to connect people with what they had heard from the Bible and see it lived out in action, put it into practice. And he says, that's what we have to do. I will show you. And then he gives us a little parable. He says, I'm going to show you what it's like. If you start with that foundation, let me show you what it looks like. If you don't have that foundation, I'm also going to show you what that looks like. And he goes from there and he says, he is like a man, the person who has this foundation. He is like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on a rock. So first of all, let me stop real quick, okay? A little backstory on Jesus right here. So they are like a man who was building a house and he dug down deep. So it wasn't like the first option. He had to go find this rock, and he built it on a rock. Now, Jesus, many of us believe, like, I don't know if you grew up like I did, you were taught that Jesus was a carpenter, that Jesus worked with wood. That's highly unlikely that Jesus was a carpenter. The word that we get that from is a word, it's tekton. In that word, in Greek, you might hear the word like technician, technical. That's what it means. It's a technical laborer. That's all it means, somebody that worked with their hands. And so Jesus was likely not a carpenter, because in that area, if you've ever been in the Middle East, you know there's not a lot of wood to work with. Not a lot of trees, not a lot of forests. Wood was very, very expensive and very, very hard to come by. So most tables were not made out of wood. The only wood that would have really been found in most homes would have been, if there was like maybe a small table, but mostly a door, if people could afford a door, was with wood. But most of the time that was just a blanket or a sheet basically hanging over that door. There was not a lot of wood in the area. Jesus probably was not a wood worker. What Jesus probably was a stone mason. Tables, chairs, other things around your house would have been made out of stone. He was probably a stone mason. He probably worked with his hands, but he probably worked with stone, actually. And what Jesus most likely built when he was young, so he lived in Nazareth. We know that, Jesus of Nazareth. He lived in Nazareth. About 5 miles north of Nazareth, there was a massive development happening in Rome. And Herod Antipas had become the ruler. He was the son of Herod the Great. And he started building a new city. And it was called Sepphoris, not like the makeup counter, like this, what is that, Sephora? Not that. Similar. And it was like this real fancy, this new development. It actually had been a Jewish city, but it had been ruined. And so he came in and said, I want this as our new epicenter of Rome. Like, I want my part of the government to rest in this city called Sepphoris. And so he built this city up on a hill, but it had been ruined so badly that what he did was he dug down deep and he started building from the stone again. Now, it's 5 miles north of Nazareth, and we know that Jesus and his dad worked together, and Joseph was also a tekton, a stone mason. It is highly, highly probable that Jesus worked on this city while he was a young boy, that he worked for the Roman government, working on this massive city, being a stone mason, seeing how a city came together. This city is also, it's just fascinating. If you ever read up on it, it's believed that Mary, Jesus' own parents, that Mary's parents lived in this city of Sephora. It was an old Jewish place, but it had become this whole epicenter. It was like a Disney Springs, in essence, type of thing. Like, it was this full downtown where you had stores and you had homes and you had all these things that you kind of do all in the same place, restaurants, all those things happening in one place. It was this big epicenter. And Jesus built on this. Now, Jesus is talking from his own experience, but what he comes to tell us about is not to sell us rocks. Like, he's not here to be like, I work with rocks, so let me tell you about how important rocks are. Let me sell you on the importance of building on a firm foundation of rocks. That's not what he's talking about. Notice what he says, that it's about the teachings that he's giving. Applying these words to your life, it's about building a foundation, not just buying rocks. So he says that this is what it's like. It's like this rock, this bedrock, that if you're going to build anything, you have to build it on this. And it's like he actually has experience with this. And it says, from there, it says that the man, when the flood came, and the torrent struck that house, it could not shake it because it was well built. He doesn't talk about how the house was built. He talks about what it was built on. And when those torrents come, when those floods happen, when all of a sudden the thing that we thought was our foundation is no longer there, when the wealth, when the people, when the politics, when the power that we were given, when the religion that we thought was the thing we could hold so firmly to, when all those things start to fall apart, that's when the torrent shows up. That's when the storm rises. And suddenly we're going, what did we stand on in the first place? What was this foundation? He says that's what happened to the first house. And because it was on a solid foundation, it was well built and it stood. But then he goes from there and it says, but one who hears my words, in verse 49, but one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built his house on the ground without a foundation. Now, notice this just real quick. If you're thinking about the Middle East, again, think about how a house would be built, but without a foundation is what it says here. The default setting for a home, the default foundation for a home was sand. That was the first option. This is a home without a foundation. It was something that would shift like crazy. It was something that did not have a foundation under it. It was simply going to move back and forth. That was what it was offering. I would say, just from my own personal viewpoint, that our world, the default foundation that the world would give us right now, is one that's going to shift. And it's one that's going to switch, and it's one that's going to sway. I mean, I love how many times I see like memes on Instagram or on Facebook that come across, and they like say like, it's from like things like silly things white girl says, or like something like that is like the page name. And it says like words to live by for 2020. And you see people post these and they're like, I'm so living like this year. Have you seen these? And it'll say like, laugh more, hug more people, be nicer, don't spit on children. Like, I don't know. I mean, just random things. Just these things. And people are like, that's so me this year. Leave toxic relationships behind. Pick up new relationships. Don't listen to anybody, but listen to the right people maybe. Like, you can't, it's all these things. You know what I'm talking about? All these things come across, and it's like from these little meme sites, and people are like posting them, and they'll be like, yeah, that's so me this year. I'm like, do you even know who wrote that? Are these words to live by? Are you sure? This is the foundation you want to set up for 2020 is a random meme that came across your timeline on Facebook? That's where you want to build your foundation? That's how you're going to live in 2020? I don't know that that's a solid foundation. I'm just saying from my little point of view, I don't know that that's where I'd want to put all my eggs in that basket. But I think that the world we live in, that's like what we think is wisdom. That's what we think is solid. That's what we think is going to last. And what we see is like the next meme that comes out from that same page, you're like, oh, I don't agree with that at all. I don't like that one. I mean, it's crazy. And this is where we're putting our hope and our foundation. Is in these things. The world, the default setting for the world is something that's going to shift. It's something that's going to sway. It's something that's going to switch at some point. That's what the default setting is. And Jesus is saying that's what the default setting here is. The house just without a foundation on the normal setting of sand, it's going to shift. It's going to sway. And the moment that the torrent struck that house, it collapsed. Its destruction was complete. Notice this just real quick. Notice that with the house that's well built, he does not say that there will not be storms. He does not say that just because you follow the teachings of Jesus, there's no storms. That's not what he says. Both homes are struck by storms. He's not offering us just a place to get away from the storms. He's offering us a shelter in the storms. He's saying there's going to be a time in this world where you're going to try to set up a foundation. You're going to try to set your feet into something. I don't think that's all bad. Let me just say this real quick. If you've been a part of maybe church for a long time, maybe when I was growing up, let me say it this way. When I was growing up, there was a big movement of things where it was like, this earth is temporary, heaven's my home. And so kind of this idea of like what happens here on earth doesn't really matter. There was kind of this feeling of like, because someday I'm just going to go to heaven, that's where everything matters. What I do here doesn't really matter because someday I'm just going to get to heaven and that's where everything really matters. I don't know if anybody else kind of grew up that way, but it kind of felt like we were just living this life so that we could get to the next one. I don't think that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here because Jesus is saying what you are setting up here on earth actually does matter. In fact, I would challenge that at the beginning of time, when God creates the world, it actually says that God was here in the world. And in Revelation, if you actually pay attention to Revelation, it is not about us going to heaven. It is about heaven coming to earth. And Jesus himself, when he shows up, what does he do? He doesn't just come down here to just drag all of us that believe in him off the earth and immediately to another place. He comes to earth to bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. What you're setting up here does matter. What you're doing here on earth does matter. And you're going to try to set up these fortresses. And the question is, what is the foundation of those? And the question shouldn't be, where is the foundation? Is it here or is it in heaven? That's not the question of where is the foundation. The question is, who is the foundation? Is Jesus the foundation? I was with some people not long ago. I was working on, I do some other things outside of the church. I message with businesses and nonprofits on how they tell their stories. And I can explain that another time because it's a really weird thing that I do. And I was with an organization just recently. It's a big surf company here in Florida. They're on every major beach in Florida, and I was doing their new ad campaigns with them. And they've been having a lot of social media storm, like been good things happening, but there's been a lot that they've been handling. So I was meeting with them. We did a shoot one day in Fort Lauderdale, and then I got done with their shoot, and I was meeting with some of their executives. And while we were talking about kind of their marketing strategy, different things, we were talking about all this stuff. And so they asked me, they said, so how did you get into this? And I was telling them, they said, so is this all you do? And I said, no, I'm also a pastor. I don't tell people that a lot, guys. Like if you've been around me, you know the first thing out of my mouth is not that I'm a pastor. I usually start with I'm a lumberjack. That's usually the first thing. People are always like, oh yeah, okay. I'm a tecton. I work with stone or wood, you choose. And so I usually start with something else, but I said, I'm a pastor, and they said, and so we got into this conversation about this, and they asked me, some different things, and I said, well, actually last year, this last year in 2019, I wrote a book, and I wrote a book for our church, and they said, oh, well, that's interesting, and so what's that about? And I said, well, it's a book about following Jesus. That's what the whole thing's about. It's about like the practices of Jesus and just following Jesus. And they were like, well, and I could tell this one girl, she was sitting there, and she was the designer person because she had a nose ring. That's how you know who the designer is. And she was looking at me, and she gave me this weird look, and she was like, and she said, so like that's the book you wrote. And I was like, yeah, that's the book I wrote. I wrote it for our church, and I tried to explain it a little bit more. And I wrote it honestly just for us to have a way to practice this. And we're going to start that in February. If you haven't done the lab yet, I would encourage you to do it. Not because I want to. It's not even to sell you a book. It's for free. So you can do this because I think it's awesome. But in February, we're going to do the lab. And I wrote this book on the practices of Jesus. And she said, so you could have written a book on other things. I said, yeah, I mean, I do this messaging with businesses, and I probably will write a book on that someday. But this is the one that I started with because I thought these were really important. And she looked at me, and like she had some really cool hipster glasses that were clear but big. And she kind of moved them down a little bit. And she was like, why would you write about that? Like, why would you give so much time to that? And I was like, well, it's a good question. It felt a little bit like she was asking me, why do you call him Lord? Like, why? What's the reason behind this? I mean, have you guys ever sat down and actually thought this through? Why? Why are you here? Why do you do this? Why do you call Jesus your Lord? Why? What is in it? Why? What's in it for you? What's the thing that's driving you to do that? What is the motivation? Maybe you've never thought about it. Maybe you haven't thought about it in a long time. Why do you call him Lord? And so I told her, I said, the only thing I can tell you is that I really believe that the way of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth about wealth and about sexuality and about relationships and about serving and about humility and about pride and about love, I think it's the best way to live your life. And that's all I could tell her. I think it's the best way to live your life. I believe that this foundation is the one that is the right one. I don't know what your answer is to why do you call him Lord. I can tell you for me, I believe that this is the best way to live not just the next life, but it is the best way to live this life here on this earth. I believe that following these teachings are that important. And we have to set our foundation before we change everything about us this year, before we change all the things that we want to change and the things we don't want to change this year. We have to set this foundation. this year first and foremost. So maybe you're here and you're in a couple spots. Maybe you're here and you're like, okay, I don't know the teachings of Jesus, so I don't really know what that foundation looks like. That's fine. I get that. Maybe you're here and you're like, okay, I know some of those teachings, but I've heard them, but I'm not doing them. That's fine too. Maybe you're here and you're like, no, I just need to make sure this is the foundation before I do anything else and change all the other things about me. I need to make sure this foundation's set. I think the best thing for us to do is there's a little card on your seat. And what I did was I just took the book of Mark, and it's the shortest gospel of Jesus. And in that reading plan, there's a little reading plan there. And every day, all it is a few verses a day to get you through the book of Mark. What I would encourage you to do is start reading through that plan. Make that part of the foundation of something you do every single day. And in that, my hope is that all of us learn together, that we learn Jesus' teachings. My hope is that we hear Jesus' teachings in those and that we actually take them and apply them. Maybe there's things that you read that you've never read before. Maybe there's things in there that you've never investigated before. Maybe there's questions in there that you've never asked before. Take those teachings of Jesus, read through the story of his life where he connects the things you've heard and the things you do. He puts them together. Read through his life and see about the things that you're going, oh, wow, I've heard that, but I've never done that. Or I've never heard that, but now I've got a lot of questions. Maybe you're in one of those spots. My encouragement for you is to start your year off that way. There's 32 days on there. I'm sorry I couldn't make it 31 for like January or whatever. Then the columns wouldn't have been even, and you can't do that. It's not biblical. So but every day it's just a few verses. My encouragement would be to take that and every single day read that. If you're in a group that meets every week, you're going to be going through these readings together. Just spend some time on that. You'll be able to go through these, ask questions about what is going on. If you're not in a group yet, talk to us after service. We'd love to get you in a group. That would be a great thing for you to do going into this next year, is to be in a group where you can study this even further. We're going to be going through these readings just so you can ask questions and then ask, how can I take what I've heard and now do what I've heard? Jesus is saying this is the foundation, and the foundation is not where you've placed it, it's who you've placed it on. And I believe with all my heart, and I hope that you believe too, that we call him Lord. And the reason we call him Lord is because he is the best person to follow. His teachings, his life is the best thing to follow, not just in the next life, but in this life as well. So my hope is that you'll go through that and spend some time in that together. Today, as we close, I would ask if you'd like to pray. We're going to be back in the prayer room, back over here, and we'd love to pray with you. If you're new, just come meet with us over here at the connection desk. We'd love to get you connected and have you more involved in what's going on here. But no matter where you're at in your spiritual journey, I would challenge you, I'd beg you to read through the reading plan. Just read through Mark and learn about the things that you can learn from Jesus and his teachings, so that when he says, why are you calling me Lord? That you can say, because I not only have heard you, but I'm doing what you said. So let's stand together. I want to pray for you this week as we go into our week together. Let's pray. Father, I thank you so much for this time. I just thank you for this place to be together, to be able to join as a community and just to follow you. And there might be some of us in this room right now, Lord, that we would say, we call you Lord, and yet we're not doing what you say. And for that, we're sorry. For that, we apologize for trying to call you Lord and not doing the things you say. And I pray today, God, if that's true of us, that we would be honest with you. I also want to pray if there are those of us in this room that really don't even know the things you say, the teachings that you have. I pray that we would just be bold enough and courageous enough to learn them, to start to learn what you teach and the way that you lived while you were here. I pray that you would make us bold enough not just to hear them, but to actually apply them and to do them. And God, I pray that over this next year, that as things will inevitably shift and things will sway and things will switch places and things will just constantly change, I pray that you would remind us that you are our firm foundation. It's not found in wealth. It's not found in people. It's not found in politics. It's not found in power. It's not found in religion, but you alone are the one who is our firm foundation. May we remind ourselves of that as things inevitably will shift and change. May we make you the foundation of everything we do in this new year. I praise things in your name. Amen. Amen. Thanks for being here. Love you guys. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.